Last time we spoke about the beginning of the Battle of Moscow. German offensives towards Moscow and Rostov pressed on despite severe logistical strains, scarce trains, fuel, and winter clothing. Heavy snow in Atsputsitsa slowed movements and a growing strain on supply lines. The Red Army, led by Generals Zhukov and Rokossovsky, resisted with fortified defenses, minefields, and deliberate countermeasures, while Stavka reshuffled commanders and maintained pressure to keep the German forces tied down. By mid-November, the Soviets began exploiting a minor opening near Tikhvin, stretching German lines, but German reinforcements and the stubborn defense around key corridors prevented a decisive breakthrough. In Moscow's vicinity, German plans for a rapid encirclement confronted entrenched Soviet defenses and fuel shortages that limited the panzer operations. Guderian's group faced fuel and supply constraints, with tanks often immobilized, with Soviet counterattacks intensifying. Meanwhile, the road of life opened up over Lake Ladoga, began to sustain Leningrad, and Allied material was reaching Soviet hands, complicating the German strategic picture. This episode is the first great victory of the Red Army. Well, hello again, and welcome back to the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on both of those, we just released a 7-hour-long episode covering the Greco-Persian Wars. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for subjects I will tackle next. The flanking armies defending Moscow crumpled as the Battle of Moscow began, and the panzer commanders smelled blood in the water as they surged forward with renewed momentum. Meanwhile, Leib found himself increasingly embattled as Red Army forces smashed into his overextended salient at Tikhvin. To the south, Kleist faced a poised Chalice in Rostov, his now overextended Panzer Army coming under attack from multiple directions. On November the 25th, Group Bachmann was finally halted in its northward drive, 6 kilometers short of the Volkhov, and just short of the Voibokalo area. On the 26th, the Soviets counterattacked with the 3rd Guards Rifle Division, the 310th and 311th Rifle Divisions, joined by the 6th Naval Rifle Brigade, and these units slammed into the German 21st Infantry Division. Over the next few days, the Soviets thrust the Germans back several kilometers, but their momentum began to wane. As a result, Halder ordered Leib to abandon the Volkhov push and reinforce the drive towards Voklyovstroy. Halder's 19th Diary entry read, "In the Army General Headquarters, North is becoming increasingly obvious that the attack on Shum has miscarried. The main effort by von Bolkmann's group must be shifted against Voklyovstroy. An order to this effect is issued." At the same time, Fudinsky received the 80th Rifle Division transferred from the Leningrad front, and along with this unit, he was ordered to form a new shock group to drive the Germans back from the Voibokalo station. For the entirety of this week, all 3 shock groups of the 4th Army continued their assaults, keeping the Germans around Tikhvin in a state of perpetual crisis, but making little headway against the stubborn resistance. The 52nd Army likewise pressed its pursuit of the 126th Division back towards the Volga, where a new German defensive line along the river halted the advance. Attacks aimed at the Sinyavino corridor persisted, characterized by ongoing small and largely futile probes against the German positions. These efforts achieved nothing substantial beyond pinning additional German troops and inflicting disproportionate casualties. These attacks were part of the ongoing Second Sinyavino Offensive, active since about October. Commander Shvaldin, dismissed for failures, was reassigned to lead the Arkhangelsk military district. The first truck convoy crossed the Road of Life and reached Leningrad on November the 23rd of 1941. The very next day, a second convoy arrived carrying about 19 tons of supplies. The road endured constant assaults from the brutal weather, which required ongoing engineering work to maintain and widen it. To increase the output, a second road had already been started on the 18th of November, and it was completed by the 28th, and it stretched about 28 kilometers from Kokorevo to Komona. As the ice thickened, an increasing number of routes were surveyed and constructed to expand the Road of Life. By the end of November, daily supply output stood at about 128 tons, a figure that alleviated the worst famine but fell far short of meeting the food shortage scale. To ease demands on supplies, women, children, and the wounded were evacuated on the return journey, echoing the civilian evacuations when river barges operated before the ice had formed. By the end of winter, 514,000 people would be evacuated from Leningrad. Over in Arkhangelsk, the 59th Army formed from the Ural and Siberian recruits under Galinin, trained primarily for defense. Likewise, the 2nd Shock Army, raised in the Volga district from the southern men unaccustomed to northern winters, suffered under Sokolov's inept leadership, who dismissed problems with the refrain. Apparently, they would carry their skis even when marching over deep snow, as they were so unfamiliar with them. This obviously negated any benefits of being issued them in the first place, while serving to increase the weight that they would carry. "This is Stalin's order. We should fulfill it." Frontline commanders such as Hopna began to believe that their offensive would fall short of it. With the Battle of Moscow already underway, the 23rd of November saw Bock meet with Halder and Brauchitsch to press the gap between the OKH map room and, well, reality. He argued against overestimating divisional strengths, calling the offensive the Army's 11th hour. All divisions were overstretched, suffering heavy officer losses and enduring the brutal cold. More German soldiers were now being treated for sickness than from wounds due to the cold. Even this was brushed away by Halder as a ratio of 1 to 1.4 wounded to sick, which was better than World War I's 1 to 4. Some companies had been reduced to just 20 or 30 men. Yet neither Halder nor Brauchitsch appeared receptive to his concerns. Bock's diary entry had this to say: Brauchitsch, like Halder, nevertheless advocated a continuation of the Panzer Army's attack, even at the risk that it might be pulled back later. Both stressed once again that the important thing was to inflict as much damage as possible on the enemy. When I said to Halder that I am doing what I can, he replied, "Yes, we are very pleased about that." Halder would later admit that Germany would never again muster a force equal to what it had at the start of Operation Barbarossa. The war in the East, he suggested, would likely become one of endurance. Yet this insight was undercut by the continued insistence that attacks would proceed to secure favorable ground for the next offensive immediately after. Halder also admitted that it would be impossible to secure 100% of the USSR due to its size or endless manpower. This train of thought, however, was not continued to its logical conclusion by any general at the meeting. In Halder's view, the goals of the offensive included achieving a link-up with the Finnish forces at Lake Ladoga, encircling Moscow, and advancing to capture the Don and Oka regions, as well as Maikop. Notably, there was little consideration given to the state of German industry or access to raw materials, factors that would prove vital in sustaining a war of endurance. However, several frontline commanders, such as Hopna, began to believe their offensive would fall short of its goal. Morale amongst the soldiers was collapsing as more and more tried to avoid going to the front, offering excuses like accompanying the wounded back to the rear lines. The losses of junior officers and NCOs hindered any attempts to reverse this decline in enthusiasm. For many, reaching Moscow had shifted from a strategic aim to a promise of warmth and safety. Depression also grew over a lack of mail from home for periods of up to 6 weeks. The cold had improved the distribution of the post, but it only improved by the end of November. By the very end of November, it took on average about 3 weeks for a letter from Germany to reach the soldiers at the front line. The censorship office would have a nightmare when the postal service recovered due to a flood of letters bearing the soldiers' suffering. Yet that very outpouring in the letters home would help stabilize many German soldiers' mental state. Hitler was increasingly unsettled about the offensive's prospects, yet too frightened to repeat the perceived World War I Marne mistake by backing off at such a critical moment. Buck had said this to Hitler at that time. "The last battalion that can be thrown in will be decisive." The last reserves had to be committed, and the attack pressed home with iron will to force a win. He grew irritable at the looming possibility of failure and began lashing out at just about anybody he saw as a scapegoat. Unable to accept blame, he browbeat those around him into submission, and a culture emerged in which everyone began simply agreeing with whatever he said, or else they faced removal and public disgrace. They even coached newcomers on what to say. Meanwhile, Jodl and Keitel from the LKH started filtering bad news before it even reached Hitler, while Halder and Brauchitsch ignored what did reach them. Hitler's mood would be worsened by news of the great success of Operation Crusader, which saw the relief of Tobruk, along with his Minister of Armaments and Munitions. Again, for anyone who's interested, over at my podcast, the Echoes of War podcast, we did a 10-part series covering the entire North Africa campaign, and it has a surprising effect on the Eastern Front. If you are into the logistics of World War II, I'd say it's right up your alley. Now, over to the north of Moscow, Reinhard and Holpner continued their drive forward. The pace of the advance remained slow through the dense forests and swampland that dominated the terrain, forcing constant head-on engagements with little opportunity for flanking maneuvers. Holpner averaged about 4 kilometers a day since the start of the offensive. Reinhard would average about 6 kilometers a day. German troops lamented how effectively the Soviet forces could camouflage themselves and their defenses in these conditions, often performing extravagant ambushes. Soviet troops fought with increasing fanatical resolve, and a rising number of counterattacks were launched against the panzer spearheads, inflicting further losses on the advancing formations. One example was Marjustino. This village was captured on the 24th with 500 Soviets found dead, and only 150 of its defenders surrendered. Flak 88 guns in an anti-tank role had severely depleted many divisions' air defense. VVS attacks were near constant while the Luftwaffe was effectively absent from the sector. The 6th Panzer Division reported being strafed every 15 minutes on the 27th, while the 7th Panzer Division reported 18 separate large-scale air attacks in a single day. The need for Flak 88s in an anti-tank role had severely depleted many divisions' abilities to fight aircraft. As a result of the attrition, the 6th Panzer Division had only 13 functional tanks left by the 26th, down from an initial 100. Similarly, the 7th Panzers had begun the offensive with about 120 tanks, but by the 25th they reported only 40 functional tanks. The 56th Panzer Corps had lost 160 tanks in 10 days at the spearhead of Panzer Group 3. Exact figures for Panzer Group 4 were not known, but they were also believed to be heavily depleted. The tank shortage and the weakness of the infantry led to the creation of tank crew battalions, which were badly equipped and not trained for tasks, resulting in extreme casualties for these formations. One company of 160 were formed in mid-November. By January, only 18 were left. Most losses were from frostbite, as they lacked the skills to survive in winter, as an infantryman rather than being able to sleep in the relative warmth of their tank. Also, their black uniforms were not the best camouflage in the white snow of winter. In parallel, the Wehrmacht scavenged manpower from the rear area formations and even from the Luftwaffe to replace frontline losses, degrading the Army's overall capabilities by losing rear area specialists and leaving a pool of poor-quality frontline infantry, who also suffered disproportionate casualties. Baron von Richthofen's diary entry about sending pilots and aircraft maintenance crews into the front line as infantry read as such. People will enjoy the opportunity to have a go again at the enemy from 150 meters with a rifle. In the same pattern of degradation, most of the motorized infantry had long since been reduced to advancing on foot due to a lack of trucks and fuel. Still, both panzer groups pressed forward. Clinton fell to the 7th Panzer Division on the 23rd, while the 2nd Panzer Division captured Solnechnogorsk. Afterwards, Rokossovsky was finally allowed to retreat to a new line from the south of Solnechnogorsk to Istra, where his 16th Army would link up with the 5th Army. A scratch force comprising engineers, anti-aircraft gunners, and reserves from other sectors of the front were thrown into the line to cover Rokossovsky's withdrawal. A platoon from every single division across the Western Front had been withdrawn from their commands in order to help create this force and bolster the depleted 16th Army. Meanwhile, the 30th Army was forced northward, creating a 45-kilometer breach between the two Soviet armies into which Reinhardt surged. By the 26th, the terrain opened up for Schall's 51st Panzer Corps, which aimed to sever the Volga-Moscow Canal. It had originally been thought to be a major obstacle in the encirclement of Moscow. Now Bock thought it to be a vital flank protection for Reinhardt's panzer group as it turned towards Moscow. On the 28th, they reached the canal's western bank at Ayakroma and secured a crossing, placing Reinhardt now only 35 kilometers from Moscow. Reinhardt begged to be allowed to continue east, but Bock insisted he turn towards Moscow. As had become the habit for panzer commanders, Bock's orders were ignored, as Reinhardt privately issued orders for the following week to attack eastward over the canal. Hopna meanwhile maintained the pressure against Rokossovsky in a direct push towards the capital. This advance was much slower, with constant frontal attacks against prepared positions. Isla fell to the SS Das Reich on the 26th, leaving the Germans 35 kilometers from the outskirts of Moscow and about 50 kilometers from the Red Square. However, the town had required several days of bloody fighting to secure, and after the final Soviet soldier had been driven out, thousands of explosives detonated over the course of several days. Over 1,100 mines and 250 kilograms of high explosives had been removed by German engineers. Even in victory, the German soldiers were denied shelter from the cold by the Soviets. On the 28th, the advance elements of Das Reich claimed to reach a village about 15 kilometers from Moscow and managed to fire artillery at one of the suburbs. Countless historians have pointed to Skozenski's claim as apparent proof that the Germans were close to capturing Moscow, and thus magically winning the entire war. Yet this viewpoint overlooks the tens of thousands of uncommitted Red Army soldiers garrisoning the city, and ignores the fact that Moscow had been turned into a literal fortress over several months. Reaching the suburbs was by no means equivalent to actually capturing or holding the Soviet capital. It also ignores the 10 uncommitted Soviet armies waiting in reserve. Otto Skorzenski's memoir admitted that their offensive had come to an end, with the 10th Panzer Division reduced to only 20 tanks, while his own division had lost most of its artillery due to a lack of tractors to move the guns. By the 28th, the 11th Panzers had about 15 tanks, the 10th Panzers about 20 tanks, the 5th Panzers about 70 tanks. The 20th was down to 54. Thus, in total, both panzer groups ended November with about 235 tanks, fewer than several of the individual panzer divisions at the start of Barbarossa. Bock would call Harder to inform him that the offensive was likely near its end, and would have to be called off within a matter of days if the Soviets did not collapse. Bock believed any further attacks would be, quote, a soulless frontal clash with an enemy who seems to command inexhaustible reserves of men and material. It must not come to a second Verdun. As the panzers ran out of steam, their commanders repeatedly pressured Klug to commit his extremely weak left wing into the offensive. OKH and Bock were also making their impatience with his caution known. Eventually, he would succumb to the pressure and order an attack on December the 1st unless forbidden from doing so. No serious thought was given to the possibility of a Soviet counteroffensive by any senior German general at this point. As the Germans were worn down assaulting layer upon layer of defenses, 5 Soviet armies were ordered to form up along the Volga in the last week of November. 3 were positioned behind Moscow, the 10th Army along the Oka River. The 61st Army was sent to protect the flank of the southwestern front. The Germans remained blissfully unaware of their existence. Stavka grew increasingly ruthless. As early as the 17th, Stalin had ordered a concentrated effort to destroy all possible shelter available to the Germans, regardless of civilian suffering this policy would cause. The VVS and artillery were to barrage any settlement in the prescribed zone, while ski troops and partisans infiltrated behind lines to destroy buildings that they could reach. By the 29th, over 400 villages had been razed. One German soldier described the character of the fighting at the time as, quote, operations themselves often centered around groups of houses, the possession of which was the main objective of the fight. The winners would move into the shelters against the deadly cold. The losers would have to run back to undisputed shelters. On the 23rd, the already fluctuating Guderian reported to Bock that he could reach his initial objectives, though he admitted an alarming reduction in strength across all of his divisions. Across the entire Panzer Army, each company averaged only 35 to 40 men, and only about one-third of its artillery was functional. There were just 37 tanks available across all 4 panzer divisions. Direct firing from Soviet flak guns had taken quite a heavy toll on the German tanks, compounded by adverse weather conditions. There was concern about Guderian's lengthening of his southern flank, but Bock decided that the Second Army would simply extend its lines northward. This meant 7 weak infantry divisions would be stretched over 350 kilometers of the front line between the 2nd Panzer Division and the immobile northern wing of Army Group South. Bock admitted in his diary that this arrangement could not hold in the long run, but believed it was worth the risk to enable Guderian's offensive to succeed. As was put in his diary, "If the 2nd Panzer Army really does reach the Oka River between Lausanne and Kolomna, it will be left hanging there in an exposed position, unless this drive also causes the enemy to withdraw in front of the 4th Army. All that is available to cover the 2nd Panzer Army's southern flank are the forces of the 2nd Army, meaning 7 quite weak divisions manning about 350 kilometers of the front, the distance to the immovably fixed northern wing of Army Group South. All this won't work in the long run, but as long as there's a chance that the enemy in front of the 4th Army might give ground in the face of the 2nd Panzers, Guderian's drive must be continued, even if the Panzer Army might be pulled back again after reaching the Oka, and after thoroughly destroying the railroad between Lausanne and Kolomna." Bock and Guderian sought approval for the plan from Halder, who did approve it. Halder warned that they would not be able to withstand any counterattack, but he did not believe one would likely occur anyways. Guderian changed his mind again on the 24th, and he sent his liaison officer, the OKH, to request that his offensive be called off. When nothing changed, Guderian absolved himself of any responsibility and blindly followed his orders. This new pessimism came even as Mikhailov was captured by the 10th Motorized Division. Iberbach's group had forced their way through Soviet lines and were making substantial progress. Despite realizing that Soviet troops were massing along all sides of the salient, Iberbach ignored the danger and he charged forward. On the 27th, he slammed right into the 10th Army near Kashira. After the ensuing battle, not only was his offensive halted, but his forces were forced to retreat all the way back to Morz. The 1st Guards Cavalry Corps had led the Soviet counterattack at Kashira under its commander, Belov, an effort that revived Soviet pre-war doctrines of cavalry mechanized groups for deep and lasting penetrations of enemy lines. Iberbach's forces had been so dispersed that Belov managed to infiltrate several squadrons behind the German lines before the attack even began. His offensive on the 27th was a complete success, with further counterattacks by the 49th and 50th Armies striking Guderian's panzer forces repeatedly. On that same day, the encirclement of Stalinogorsk was shattered as the thinly stretched 29th Motorized Division suffered heavy losses. They had faced only the 239th Siberian Rifle Division, which had abandoned all of its heavy equipment and vehicles in a desperate charge to break free. These twin defeats and the ensuing casualties on the 27th would lead Bock to label the day a black day for the 2nd Panzer Army. The 43rd Army had attempted to encircle Tula from the city's northwest, but the offensive barely left its starting position in the face of strong Soviet resistance. Rather than admitting fault, Guderian rapidly blamed Kluge's inaction for these failures. He demanded that Bock force Kluge to attack. Otherwise, he argued, he would be forced to cancel his Tula operations. He also pressed for reinforcements from Kluge's army. Bock refused both demands. Kluge was rapidly becoming a scapegoat. While all this drama outside of Moscow unfolded, the offensive mounted by the Southern Front last week continued. Building on the earlier success, several rifle divisions, 2 cavalry divisions, and 2 tank brigades struck the SS Viking and the Slovak Motorized Division on the 27th. The 14th Army Corps managed to avoid the complete collapse, but was steadily pushed back under pressure. This left the 3rd Panzer Corps perilously exposed at the end of a long narrowing salient that threatened to be cut off. The 3rd Panzer Corps itself was also under heavy pressure, as the 13th Panzers had been pulled north from Rostov to aid the embattled 60th Motorized Division. This left the SS Liebenstandard to defend Rostov alone, though it had long since fallen to below 2/3 strength. The opposing 56th Army temporarily forced its way across the frozen Don River on the 25th before a counterattack sealed the breach in the line. Every day brought a fresh assault on the beleaguered SS troops in Rostov, who were not strong enough to endure prolonged urban fighting once the Soviets managed to cross the ice. Kleist had originally planned to move to the Tozlov River on the 21st to contract his defensive line and free up some troops for the Warsaw sectors. This had been sufficient to relieve the mounting pressure across his entire army. By the 28th, it was clear to Kleist that he could not hold Rostov, as the mounting pressure was simply too great. His panzer divisions averaged only 12 to 24 operational tanks, and his infantry companies averaged around 50 men each. Meanwhile, 21 Soviet divisions were confronting the 3rd Panzer Corps around Rostov. Thus, without waiting for authorization from higher command, Kleist ordered Mackensen to evacuate Rostov. The Panzer Army was to fall back to more defensible terrain along a shorter line. Despite what many sources claim, on the 28th Hitler had agreed with Rundstedt that it was Kleist's responsibility to decide whether to retreat or not. Hitler had to explain to Halder that the situation did not require Rostov to be held at all costs, and that there was not enough help to sustain the current German positions. The familiar friction between Hitler and Rundstedt would center on where exactly the retreat would stop, but that breakdown in relations would occur next week. Moving at a pace of 25 kilometers per day, the retreat matched the tempo of the early Barbarossa days. On the 29th, Kleist informed Army Group South that he would be falling back to Krim and then Mokry-Chalta River, and Rundstedt approved this plan. He would reach that line on the same day. By then, at a cost of 158,577 dead and missing since the 28th of September, the Southern Front had finally managed to halt the seemingly invincible advance of the Army Group South. There had simply been no reserves to plug the breaches formed in Kleist's lines. Halder and the staff of Army Group South pressured Reichenau to attack with his 6th Army towards Kupiansk, but Reichenau refused, arguing that the offensive would deplete and exhaust his divisions, and he simply lacked the supplies for such an offensive action. He even traveled to Army Group headquarters on the 27th to persuade instead to not order such an attack. His offer to attack Shugev with 2 divisions was little more than a concession to Halder's demands. Frustrated by the army's inaction, Halder demanded an investigation into the Army General Staff to determine any possible shortcomings. Halder believed himself and the chiefs of staffs at the army groups to be the central pillars of maintaining the entire German war effort. The investigation concluded that such a withdrawal had been inevitable. The General Staff had realized the situation was not tenable, but agreed that the offensive solution was possible if there were several more infantry divisions and a motorized corps available. The Panzer Army's tanks were nearly immobilized due to a lack of maintenance and fuel, and starving horses mostly supplied the Army Group. There was also a desperate need for reinforcements and more mobile divisions, which were not being provided. Yet the concept of restraint appeared unknown to the General Staff, with one proposed solution being to encircle the entire Caucasus with the 11th Army to eliminate Soviet forces. In the end, even Halder was forced to admit that the Army Group did not have the strength or mobility to conduct such an offensive. Manstein's hopes of an offensive on Sevastopol were foiled this week when plummeting temperatures ruined 4 or 5 trains' worth of supplies for the 9th Army. With such reduced capacity, it would take weeks before he could even stockpile enough resources to mount such an assault. With the 42nd Corps doing nothing, on the 23rd, Huizinga suggested releasing the entire corps to the 1st Panzer Army. Sorenstern opposed this only if it was officially announced that the Kerch crossing was abandoned. Manstein bitterly opposed any and all suggestions of losing forces, insisting that he needed every division for the siege of Sebastopol. This sort of selfishness was to characterize Manstein's entire career. He constantly would strip other sections of the line and hoard resources to achieve his own goals at the expense of everybody else. In the end, only the 73rd Division was withdrawn from the 11th Army. The 42nd Corps would be left to guard the coastline of Crimea alongside the Romanian divisions attached to his army. Meanwhile, Zhukov was deciding on the 29th that the time had finally come to begin final preparations for a massive counterattack across the breadth of the USSR. Stalin would say, "Are you sure that the enemy has reached a critical point and it is in no position to bring some new large force into action?" Zhukov, "The enemy has been bled white. If we don't eliminate them now, the enemy can later reinforce his troops in the area of Moscow with large reserves at the expense of his north and south groupings." Some of the 10 armies formed as a strategic reserve had already been committed, but the bulk remained in reserve. Town after town had fallen, and plea after plea for reinforcements was either ignored or met with only the bare minimum response. All of this was in preparation for vengeance. Stavka's nerve had held through months of disaster, buoyed by Zhukov's confidence. By the start of December, 44 trained and well-equipped divisions would be ready in reserve, while another 31 had already been sent to the front lines. There were no German reserves left for the onslaught. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. If after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. If you'd like to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. By the month's end, Soviet novas mass along the Volga with 5 armies preparing for a broad counterattack. The road of life transports supplies to Leningrad. German forces suffer catastrophic attrition. Tanks, crews, and equipment are squandered, prompting talks of retreat from Rostov and a potential end to the major offensives. The Stavka wins patience and plans its revenge.